Chapter 30. What power? Alice stood on the borderline that separated the thick jungle she had just emerged from, and the white forest that stood before her with its white-leaf trees and branches that pointed to the skies. Alice stuck out her arm and put it into the light of the white forest and knew instantly there was something strange, something different about this place. Alice immersed herself into the white light of the forest and felt her body being warmed by the rays of what seemed to be a sun, but she could not see one. All she knew was that the forest brought her immense comfort, and somehow, all the things that had felt so heavy on her chest suddenly lifted itself off of her. What is this place? Thought Alice to herself. Is this the natural energy that Oliver spoke of? Why am I feeling it so strongly? I can feel it coursing through my veins. The euphoria is unimaginable. As Alice tapped into the energy around her, she quickly found herself blacking out and waking up instantly. Alice fluttered her eyes and looked around her, seeing that her surroundings had changed and she was no longer in the white forest. Rather, she stood in a small cottage that looked to be quite old and broken down. This must be another memory, said Alice. Alice, however, did not freak out or lose her cool. The process of her memories returning had become easier to bear, and she now had better control of when it happened. Alice looked around her and saw a little window to the left of her. Alice walked over and saw that the meadows stretched on for miles till they met with the mountains. Alice looked up into the bright sky and wondered if this memory was taking place on Earth or in Albeck. Alice turned around and walked to the kitchen table when she heard a loud bang and realized someone had walked into the cottage. No two people. Please, mother, please let me go, I love him, said one of the voices. No, you will not leave with that boy, replied the other voice. Listen, Mom, I love him, okay, and all my life you've tried to control me, but I can't do it anymore. I came to ask for your blessing, but you'll never give it to me. Tomorrow morning at sunrise, I'm leaving with Oliver. Alice stood in the kitchen listening on. She couldn't see the faces of the people who were talking, but she didn't have to. She knew what memory this was. Maybe the most important one because it was the one that started everything. Alice listened closely so as not to miss a single word because this memory was so significant. There was a chance that it held answers that maybe not even the immortal would be able to give her. Alice heard the sound of Helena's mother hitting her. Alice moved closer and saw Helena lying on the ground holding her cheek. Her mother stood with her back towards Alice so Alice could not see her face, but Alice watched as Helena's mother stood over her, breathing heavily before pulling Helena back to her feet. You are not leaving this house, shouted Helena's mother as she struck Helena again, but not hard enough for her to fall to the floor. You know what I am capable of, do not test me. There is nowhere you can run that I will not find you, so make it easy on yourself and don't bother trying. Your power might exceed mine, but you still have no idea how to control it. Her power, thought Alice. What did she mean by that? Alice tried contemplating on what she was hearing when she felt herself black out again, and found herself standing once again in the white forest. Alice looked around her and through the trees to see if anyone was close by, but she was alone. Alice breathed in and out, then tried to focus. What caused her to have a memory at that moment? What triggered it? And more importantly, what power was Helena's mother referring to? It was the first that Alice had heard of this. Power? What power? Alice wanted to know more. Alice thought of why Oliver wouldn't have told her about this power. Perhaps he didn't know about it. Alice still had so many questions, but now wasn't the time to stand still. She needed to move. Chapter 31. I found you. Alice wanted to process everything, but she knew she had no time. Arthur had to be found and Oliver's life was at risk. Alice checked the back of her pants where she had put the blade that Oliver had given her, and made sure it was still there. Sure enough, it was. Alice now felt confident and she started to dash through the trees of the forest with snow up to her ankles. The snow did not feel like regular snow though. It felt lighter and did not weigh her down as she ran through the pines. Alice eventually arrived at the village and was surprised that the village was much bigger than she had expected. The village looked more like a town and reminded her of how the streets looked when she had first exited the Millennium Bar and saw Albeck for the first time. Alice looked at the village and felt somewhat confused that the village did not lie deeper within the forest. Maybe it was because the light of the forest acted as enough of a protection on its own, that the villagers did not bother to venture further into the forest when first arriving. Alice walked through the streets of the village and felt completely out of place, and the fact that everyone was staring at her did not make it easier. Her clothing made her stand out, and standing out was the last thing she needed right now. Alice looked around her as she walked, trying to think of who to ask of the immortal's whereabouts, but saw that people kept their distance from her. I'm never going to find him if no one wants to speak to me, said Alice. Alice walked up to multiple people, asking and pleading with them to help her find Arthur Carrick, but no one would help her. Alice, however, kept on going and found herself entering a sort of tavern. Alice looked around her and thought of who looked like the best person to speak to when her eyes fell on the bartender. He would probably know something, Alice thought to herself. Alice approached the bar when a man stepped in front of her, blocking her way. Alice tried walking around him, but he moved in front of her again. "Excuse me, miss," said the man as he smiled at Alice. The man was big-built and looked to be in 30s. His beard covered up most of his face while the cloak he wore looked rugged and dirty. "I hear you're looking for the immortal. I know where he is, I can take you to him." "Really?" asked Alice. "Thank you so much. No one has even wanted to look in my direction since I got here." "Yeah, people around here don't really like outsiders," replied the man, "but hey, I don't mind helping you out. Come with me." "Thank you," said Alice as she smiled and followed the man out of the tavern. While walking down the street, Alice realized she didn't ask the man what his name was and turned to face him. When she looked over, however, his expression from the tavern had changed and he pushed Alice to the floor. Alice fell hard, hurting her hip but not taking her eyes off of the man who stood over her. "You people from the other world always think you're better than us. You think we want to live here, huh? We didn't choose this life." The man kicked Alice while she laid on the ground and Alice felt the pain course through her entire body. The memories of what happened with Jason started flashing in her head, and she remembered how helpless she felt in that moment, and Alice hated it. Alice got up and pulled out the blade that Oliver had given her and thrust it, piercing the man's shoulder. Alice pushed the blade deeper into his shoulder till she could see the blood squirting from the wound. Alice pushed for dear life, trying to injure the man enough to be able to get away from him, but just as she thought she had the upper hand, the man lifted his leg and kicked Alice back down. The man took the blade from his shoulder and threw it on the floor while moaning in agony. "I'm going to f***ing kill you," shouted the man as he ran to Alice and started beating her. Alice covered herself as best she could, but the man was much bigger than her, and even though he couldn't use one of his arms, he could still overpower her. Alice tried fighting back, but she couldn't get the man off of her. She felt scared and didn't know what to do. She felt the fear build inside her as she believed her life was about to end. As Alice kept up her arms to protect her face, one of the man's punches broke through her guard, hitting her in the jaw. The pain was unbearable and Alice felt herself going in and out of consciousness, when suddenly, the pain evaporated and Alice's blood started to boil. Alice felt something strange happening inside of her. Something familiar. Alice felt power surging through her veins and felt the same feeling of euphoria she had felt when she first walked into the White Forest. Alice stood up and looked at her arms and watched as the wounds healed themselves. Alice felt the natural energy caressing her skin as the marks faded in front of her very eyes. The man who attacked her watched on as Alice's eyes turned yellow and shined as brightly as the full moon. "Who is this woman?" thought the man as he backed up. He thought of running away, but he also wanted to finish what he started. The man charged at Alice and Alice stopped his movements just by looking at him. He could not move and Alice looked as he stood paralyzed in front of her. She could not understand where this power had come from, but she wanted to take advantage of it. Alice hit the man several times as he watched helplessly, feeling every blow. Alice hit him till she could no more than walked backwards, breathing heavily. Alice felt the power inside her fluctuating and Alice realized that she was losing control. Alice looked up and saw that the man had regained some movement and Alice felt that it wouldn't be long till he broke free. Alice watched on as the man slowly came towards her while his movements gradually became faster. "You should have killed me," said the man as he glared at her. The man now stood over Alice and Alice threw her hands up to protect herself again when suddenly, a man in a black suit and a fedora stepped behind the attacker, and snapped his neck. The man's body dropped to the floor and the man stepped over the corpse as if it was nothing and walked over to Alice and put his hand out to help her up. "I am so sorry, Alice, Oliver is going to kill me," said the man. "How do you know my name?" asked Alice. "Well, I'm Arthur. Aren't you here to..." Chapter 32 Arthur Carrick. Arthur opened the door to his home and helped Alice inside as she trembled in his arms. Arthur let go of Alice and first took off his coat and hat and hung it up before leading her down the passage and towards the kitchen. "Please sit," said Arthur as he walked over to the cabinet to take out a jar of tea bags. "I hope you don't mind, but I've been out all day and I've been dying for a cup of tea. Would you like some?" Alice shook her head while she watched Arthur move around the kitchen with a smile on his face. He didn't look the least bit bothered about anything. Did he not just kill a man? Did he not just see me almost get killed? Did he see the power that came out of her? Why did he seem so untethered, so calm, so carefree? "We don't have time for tea," said Alice as she struggled to get the words out. "Oliver is outside on the perimeter of the White Forest, fighting a small army of vampires. I told him I would try and make it out as quickly as possible. I need to get to him, but first I came here for answers. Trust me, the tea will help, said Arthur as he put the cup of tea in front of Alice. If it makes you feel any better, I got it on Earth. The tea here in Albec is SHT. Alice could not believe that Arthur had not listened to a word she had said, and had still made her the cup of tea she had not wanted. Alice looked at Arthur as he stood leaning against the kitchen counter, waiting for Alice to take a sip. Alice picked up the cup and brought it to her lips, taking a sip and felt the warm liquid course its way through her body and warmed her insides, calming her down. What's in this? Asked Alice as she looked up at Arthur, who had a smile on his face. It's just regular tea, replied Arthur with a laugh. However, I infused it with some of my natural energy. That's what's calming you down. But you already know about natural energy, don't you? Giggled Arthur. I saw you using it earlier against that guy who was attacking you. And by the way, Oliver is doing just fine. How do you know Oliver is fine? Asked Alice. And what was that power that I used? I am the immortal and I see everything, said Arthur. Do not worry about Oliver. He is much stronger than the vampires that lurk around in these jungles. Most of them are not very strong. That's why they have to camp out in these jungles in order to catch their prey as people venture to the White Forest looking for refuge. Besides, Oliver probably didn't tell you this because he's never been allowed into the White Forest, but time moves differently here. For every minute that passes outside of the White Forest, an hour would have passed here. As for the power you displayed earlier, that's a long story. So when I leave here, only a few minutes will have passed where Oliver is right now? Asked Alice. Yes, replied Arthur. That means that we can speak for as long as you want, because trust me, the more you find out, the more questions you'll have. Arthur sat down and put an ashtray on the table while lighting a cigarette, blowing the smoke up into the air. What do you mean? Asked Alice. You're here to ask about your mother, right? Yes, I am. I think that Ophelia might have kidnapped her, and is keeping her prisoner till I give her what she wants. Which is the blood of the Dracula, said Arthur, now changing his tone and facial expression as he looked away, still smoking his cigarette. Yes, replied Alice. So where is my mother being kept? If we can rescue her now, we might be able to decrease the leverage Ophelia has over us. Please, you have to help us. Ophelia might not have your mother, said Arthur as he looked into the distance, blowing smoke from into the air above him. What do you mean? It has to be her. What makes you think it isn't her? Alice protested. It's because I don't know where your mother is, Alice. If Ophelia did have her, I would be able to find her. Even if she did have a type of mage or witch helping her cloak your mother's whereabouts, I would still have gotten some sort of reading. If it wasn't Ophelia, who was it? Asked Alice, now becoming frustrated. I don't know, said Arthur, looking down at the table as he killed the cigarette. I can tell you this though, whoever has her is an even bigger threat than Ophelia. How so? Well, if this person is strong enough to hide your mother from me, then they must be powerful. All I can say is, as big of a threat Ophelia poses, so does the person who has your mother. So what do we do? Asked Alice. Ophelia wants the blood from you, right? So let her come to you. Until then, learn to harness the power you have inside of you. Tell me, what was the first thing you felt when you stepped into the White Forest? I felt the natural energy, said Alice. But why? Are humans able to feel natural energy? No, they aren't, said Arthur. The fact that you can feel natural energy means you aren't exactly human. The only people who can tap into natural energy are the elves and the mages. Maybe that's why. That's why what? Asked Alice. What do you mean I'm not exactly human? Do you know who Tabitha is, Alice? No, should I? Asked Alice. Yes, you should, replied Arthur. She was Helena's mother, and also one of the strongest mages to ever exist. It's possible that her magical abilities could have transferred over to Helena, and you're able to tap into that same power. Chapter 33. The Blood of a Mage. Arthur was right. Alice did have more questions than answers. She still didn't know if or if not Ophelia had her mother, and what's worse was if she didn't, that would mean the potential of an even greater threat. As for the possibility of Helena's mother's powers transferring over to her, Alice had no doubt that this was true. Alice remembered the first moment she had stepped into the White Forest, and the memory that was unlocked when she entered. Her mother had clearly mentioned that Helena did possess power, but it had not been unlocked yet. Arthur, can I ask you something? Asked Alice. You may, replied Arthur. Alice first thought to herself how she would phrase the question, seeing that even she didn't exactly know what she was asking. Did you know any of my other reincarnations? Asked Alice. I did, replied Arthur. Why do you ask? Well, I was wondering, did any of them show signs of a connection to the natural energy? No, they didn't, said Arthur. None of them did. I don't ever recall any of them using or tapping into the natural energy, even though they were reincarnations just like you. What does that mean? Asked Alice. I don't know, Alice, but you're different. Different from the rest of the reincarnations. Why do you say that like you know something else? Asked Alice while detecting that Arthur was not telling the full truth. Arthur got up and walked over to the window while slipping his hands into his pockets. He looked out at the snow that covered the grounds of his yard. He then turned back and looked back at Alice while crossing his arms and leaning up against the table. Oliver and I knew there was something different about you ever since we found out you were reincarnated, said Arthur. What do you mean? How did you know? Asked Alice. Well, I don't know if Oliver told you this, but I am the one who told him that you had been reincarnated. The thing is that the period between your previous reincarnation and when you were born was much longer than any previous period, meaning there was something strange about it. And you don't know what it is? Asked Alice. Unfortunately not, replied Arthur. However, I'm starting to think that there's more to your curse than we previously believed. I don't think it's as simple as Tabitha just wanting to hurt Oliver. I'm starting to think that it's about something completely different. What makes you say that? Asked Alice. I'll tell you in a moment, I just need to ask you something first. What is it? Asked Alice as she felt a little caught off guard. What memory did you have when you entered the White Forest? Asked Arthur. How did you know about that? Asked Alice, feeling completely stunned. She had not told him about it, but she had been thinking about it. Maybe he could read minds too? Alice didn't know. I felt a surge in the natural energy when you first walked into the forest, answered Arthur. These surges happen when there are spontaneous spikes within the natural energy in the forest. You created one when you tapped into your memories. Alice couldn't explain it, but she kind of knew of what Arthur was trying to say. Even before the memory had kicked in, she had the natural energy fill her body and fill her with power she had later used against her attacker. Alice remembered that in that moment when she had tapped into her power, the moment she had restricted her attacker's movements, she also did something else. Something that brought a lot into perspective. She had healed herself. Alice thought back to the morning when she woke up after the attack in the park. She remembered how when she checked for the wounds, they had been completely healed, putting her into a state of complete doubt. But now it made complete sense. Somehow she had tapped into this power while she slept, healing her own wounds. I saw Helena, said Alice finally. Which Helena did you see? Asked Arthur. Which lifetime? Her. I mean my first life, said Alice. I saw the moment when Helena had gone to ask Tabitha for permission to leave with Oliver. She obviously didn't get it and still ran away. However, Tabitha did mention that Helena had powers that could exceed her own one day. Arthur looked at Alice, now being the one with the look of shock on his face. Could it be possible that Helena had power that rivaled even Tabitha? Or even exceeded it? Because if so, then there definitely was more to the curse than previously thought. Or maybe, just maybe, the curse had been interpreted wrong this entire time and the curse was always meant for something. Chapter 34. The Monster Within. Alice, I think you should stay here in the White Forest for a little while longer, said Arthur as he walked back to the table to sit down. No, I can't, said Alice. Oliver is waiting for me outside. I left him out there with all those vampires. I don't care how strong you think he is, Arthur. There is no way he can survive out there alone. Trust me, Alice, Oliver will be fine, replied Arthur. And besides, you staying here will help him much more than if you go now. Why? Asked Alice. Because I'm going to teach you how to tap into the natural energy. Oliver thrust his sword forward, killing the vampire that rushed him, then ducked as another ran towards him from the opposite direction. Oliver looked around at his surroundings and saw dozens of eyes watching him, circling him, looking for an opening, but Oliver did not have any. Oliver had already killed almost a dozen of their men in the few minutes that they had been fighting, and did not look as if he had even broken a sweat. However, the vampires did not show any signs of retreating and started to close in on Oliver from every direction. Yes, they knew he was much stronger and much faster than him, but there was no way he could keep up with how many of them they were. And even if he could, fatigue would start to wear him down. Oliver, however, did not seem stressed about any of these things. He didn't think of the number of enemies, nor did he think he was going to lose. The difference in power was far too great. Their movements seemed slow, and their attacks felt light. It was only a matter of time till Oliver killed them all. Oliver turned around to see the attackers charging at him. Oliver quickly turned around and jumped over them while ramming his sword into the skull of one of the attackers. Oliver pulled the sword out of his head and then quickly cut the other two vampires across their backs, watching all three of them fall to the ground. Oliver looked up and looked directly in the eyes of the man who seemed to be their leader. Are you just going to stand there and send your men to die? Or are you going to come over and do something about it? Shouted Oliver. All of you are f***ing cowards, and you know what? You're the biggest f***ing coward of them all. Look at you hiding behind your men. Why don't you stop throwing their lives away, and fight me yourself? Oliver watched as the heads of the vampires shifted from him to their leader, who stood with a smile on his face and his arms crossed. Why should I fight? Why? Before the vampire could even finish his sentence, Oliver had dashed over to him, ripping out his throat, and stood over his lifeless body, holding the throat in the air. Is there anyone else? Shouted Oliver. The vampires now moved away from Oliver and slowly retreated back into the jungle, making sure not to turn their backs on Oliver before knowing they were safe to run away. Oliver threw the bloody piece of flesh to the side and wiped the blood from his hands off on the shirt of the body that lied at his feet. When he stood back up, he looked over at the white forest and saw two shadows in the distance. What is that? Thought Oliver as he walked towards the white forest, gripping the hilt of his sword tightly. Oliver looked into the bright light and felt the heat emanating from the sun, making it difficult for him to get too close. He watched as the shadows became outlines of people, and eventually he saw that it was Alice along with Arthur. Oliver felt confused. There was no way that Alice could have searched for Arthur and spoken to him in such a short period of time. Did Arthur not want to speak to her? Was that it? Nevertheless, she was back and Arthur was here too. And if Arthur wouldn't speak to Alice, he would definitely speak to him. Alice emerged from the forest first with a smile on her face, happy to see that Oliver was safe, when suddenly she stopped, and could not believe her eyes. The ground was scattered with bodies and Oliver stood covered in blood from head to toe. What did he have to do to give me that time? Thought Alice as the tears rolled down from her face. Was he really ready to throw away his life in order to give me a chance to find my mother? Alice stopped thinking and ran to Oliver, throwing herself into his arms and kissing him, grabbing him, holding him so tightly as if she was afraid to let go. He loved her and she loved him. And as they kissed, Alice promised herself that she would no longer be a burden in this fight against Ophelia or whoever came next. She would fight alongside Oliver. As the two pulled away, Alice smiled at Oliver and leaned in to kiss him again. Let's go home, okay? Said Alice. We're done here. Are you sure? Asked Oliver. You were barely in there. Time works differently inside the White Forest, said Alice. A minute outside of the White Forest is an hour inside the White Forest. I was there for almost 2 days and a lot has happened. Did it take you that long to find Arthur? And also, are you not hungry? How did you survive for 2 days? I'm fine, Oliver, said Alice. Arthur found me quite early yesterday, well, earlier, after I was getting attacked by someone from the village. What do you mean you're fine? Asked Oliver. You just told me you got attacked, so how can you be fine? What did they do to you? I managed to stop the guy from hurting me, Oliver, and also I healed my own wounds. Do you remember when I was attacked by that vampire in Central Park, and I didn't know what happened to the wounds? Well, I healed them. Somehow I'm able to tap into the natural energy. What do you mean? I don't understand, said Oliver. I didn't understand at first either, replied Alice. But don't worry, Oliver, I'm fine. I'll tell you about everything when we get home. Okay? I just want to get out of here. Okay, my love, said Oliver. Let's go. Oliver looked up at Arthur, who stood leaning against a tree, smoking a cigarette on the outskirts of the White Forest. Oliver nodded at Arthur, and Arthur waved back before turning and walking into the white of the forest and disappearing. Chapter 35. Inevitable Attraction. Oliver and Alice stumbled through the door of the penthouse just before the break of dawn, trying their best to avoid the sun. When they had returned from Albeck, Richard had offered them sanctuary till the day had passed, but Oliver had declined the offer and said that he would prefer to go home. The two walked into the penthouse, holding one another upright till they got to the lounge and fell to the floor in front of the fireplace. You said you had something to tell me, said Oliver as he stared blankly into the fireplace. He felt weakened by the light of day and was not used to being awake at this time, but he needed to know what Alice had found out. I found out a lot, Oliver, and I think that whatever we thought we knew about this curse might be wrong. What do you mean? Asked Oliver. What do you mean wrong? Well, for starters, did you know that Helena had magical abilities? Asked Alice. No, I didn't, replied Oliver. She never told me. But what does that have to do with anything? The power was passed down to me, Oliver, said Alice. When I walked into the White Forest, I had one of my memories come back. And it wasn't just any memory. What do you mean? What did you see? Asked Oliver. It was the night I went to ask Tabitha if I could leave with you, said Alice. Oliver looked at Alice in a look of complete disbelief that confused her. Why is he looking at me like that? Thought Alice to herself. Alice, said Oliver after a long pause of silence, I don't know if Arthur told you this, but I've asked every reincarnation of Helena if they could remember that night, but they couldn't. For some reason I always thought that night held so many unanswered questions, and now finally, here you are remembering it. What happened? Asked Oliver with a slither of hope in his voice. What happened the night before this started? Alice told Oliver everything, and Oliver realized that not only was there still a lot to learn about the curse, but also, Helena had kept her magical abilities a secret. Why? And what did Tabitha mean by Helena becoming stronger one day? Was that it? Oliver thought to himself. Do you have any control of the power now? Asked Oliver. Somewhat, replied Alice. I can just barely tap into the power here on Earth, whereas in Albec the natural energy was much stronger. I'm not completely useless though. Let me see the wound you've been keeping from me since we got back from Albec. How did you know about that? Asked Oliver. Well, I do have eyes, you know, said Alice as she pulled Oliver's shirt off to look at the wound. The cut was deep and Alice could not understand how Oliver was even still standing, let alone breathing. Alice put her hand to the wound and concentrated natural energy onto it, watching as the wound started healing itself. Oliver looked on in disbelief because he had never seen such powerful healing magic ever before. Alice said that she was only barely able to tap into the natural energy here on Earth. And come to think of it, she had only unlocked the power now, so what was her true potential? If Tabitha herself said that Helena would one day become more powerful than her, then what did that mean for Alice? After Alice was done, the wound looked as if it had never been there. The skin had pulled itself together and the missing tissue had been replaced. Are you okay? Asked Alice, staring into his eyes while rubbing her hand across his chest. Oliver, clenching his jaws, said, Yeah, I'm great actually. Alice rubbed her hands over the place where the wound had been and then moved them back up to Oliver's chest, caressing his skin. Oliver followed Alice's hands with his eyes as she moved them across his body slowly, her eyes locked on his skin. He placed his hand under her chin and lifted her gaze to meet his. Oliver grabbed her waist and pulled her towards him. As he kissed her, Alice wrapped her arms around his shoulders, pressing her breasts firmly against his chest. She slipped her tongue into his mouth and suddenly, Oliver turned his face away. What's the matter? Asked Alice. My fangs. I don't want you to see me like this, not in this moment. Alice placed her hand under his chin and turned his face towards her. She stepped forward, keeping her eyes locked on his. She gazed down at his fangs and when she looked up, Oliver saw her eyes beaming bright yellow. They stood in Oliver's bedroom, staring at each other. Alice's impulse pointed up as Oliver circled his thumb along the light brown rose-shaped skin around her impulse. She felt the velvet tip of his knives touch her inner thigh. She wondered what vampires tasted like. Alice took Oliver's hand and led him to the bed, where she sat at the edge with him standing before her. She looked up into his eyes before taking him into her mouth. Oliver threw his head back as Alice moved her tongue along his shaft, before taking him into her mouth again. Oliver grabbed her hair and gently lifted her to stand up. He picked her up and placed her on her back. Smiling at her, Oliver buried his face between her thighs. Alice arched her back, moaning as Oliver twirled his tongue around her CLT. She pulled him up to kiss her and as their lips pressed together, Oliver pushed himself inside of her. Gasping, Alice grabbed hold of him while their bodies rocked back and forth. Chapter 36. Taking charge. Alice awoke to see the beams of sun entering the room from all sides. The sun felt warm and comforting, and it made Alice feel energized as she bathed in its rays. Alice then looked over at Oliver, who was still sleeping, and thought to herself when last she had seen him so relaxed. Ever since she had found out about the curse, Oliver had changed and seemed to be on edge. Alice got out of bed still naked, and walked over to the window that overlooked the New York Bay. The penthouse was extremely high up, so there was no chance of her being seen. Alice sat down in front of the window, looking out at the world, and thought of everything that had happened in the past few weeks, and how everything had changed so quickly. Before all of this, she had just been a regular journalist who had to fight her way through school because of financial difficulties, someone dealing with regular people's problems. But that was no longer her, that wasn't her life anymore. Or at least whatever little life she had left. Her memories of Helena had started returning more frequently, and even now, just before waking up, another memory had returned. Alice wept silently at the thought of dying. She was scared and she couldn't help it. Alice looked over her shoulder and watched Oliver as she thought of how hard it would be to lose him again. Yes, again, because that's what she had seen in her memory. She dreamt of dying in Oliver's arms. She felt his tears hitting her face as her own ran down into his hands as he held her. It must have been hard for him too, Alice thought to herself. I just got born again and got to live most every lifetime with a man who loved me from the very second he saw me again, but he never got that. Oliver kept on living, and has been carrying around all of that loss for hundreds of years. This curse has to come to an end. Alice thought back to what Ophelia had said about King Dracula's blood, and that she had planned to use it to cast a spell, giving her the ability to walk in the sun. When Alice was in the White Forest, Alice had asked Arthur about the spell, and he said the spell was meant to give you the mark of life. The mark would be able to give its user a new life, a better one. For vampires, it would give them the ability to walk in the sun. Maybe that's the gift I can give Oliver. All these years he has had to live his life in the shadows. The only places he could be safe were places like his penthouse, where he told me that he had gotten a special tint on the windows that didn't allow the harmful rays from the sun to enter, but at least he could still look at the sun. He was so satisfied even through all of the struggles, and it killed her just thinking about it. She hated that he was satisfied with it. He was locked in this cage made up of his immortality and constant loss. He was so far gone, and it killed Alice to think of how many times Oliver had died inside before he became numb, and just started living for the hopes of seeing her again in the next lifetime. Alice decided that enough was enough. Ophelia knew more about the blood than anyone else, even Arthur. Also, she might know where her mother was. The best time to go to her would be now, during the day. Ophelia probably had the same tint on her office windows, but that meant she wouldn't be able to leave her office, putting her at a disadvantage. If anything did go wrong, she could just step out of the office and Ophelia wouldn't be able to follow her. Alice felt confident in her plan and also in her power. She could now use natural energy, and Ophelia didn't know this. She had a way to protect herself, and she didn't need Oliver. She wanted to end this on her own. I have to get the blood before Ophelia, said Alice as she stood up and got dressed. Oliver cannot go on living like this. How many more 100 years does he have to watch me die? Alice sat down on the bed and put on her shoes before getting up and kissing Oliver and exiting the room. As she made her way down the stairs, she heard a sound coming from the kitchen. When Alice got downstairs, she was happy to see that it was Trevor, who looked to be making breakfast, or lunch judging by the time. Good afternoon, Miss Grayson, said Trevor as he threw the chopped vegetables into the pan. Hello, Trevor, said Alice. It's been a while. How have you been? My back still hurts a bit, but it's nothing to fuss over, said Trevor as he smiled and pulled out a seat for Alice by the kitchen counter. Please allow me to make you something to eat before you leave. Alice found it strange that Trevor was well aware that she was leaving, but did not look as if he planned on stopping her. But although Alice thought it strange, she accepted his offer and sat down. Would you like green pepper in your omelet? Asked Trevor as he stood with his back facing Alice and leaned over the stove, throwing salt into the pan. Yes, please, replied Alice. Trevor made all the food and placed it in front of Alice with a cup of coffee, then stood back and waited till Alice finished eating. Alice didn't realize it, but she was much hungrier than she thought she was, and the omelet was the first thing she had eaten since getting back from Albeck. This is so good, Trevor, said Alice as she ate slowly, trying to figure out what Trevor was planning to do. Was he going to try and talk her out of leaving? She didn't know. All she did know was that nothing would stop her from seeing Ophelia and confronting her about the blood, and also her mother's whereabouts. Thank you, Miss Grayson, replied Trevor. But listen, be careful, okay? I know that you're going to go and do something reckless now. What do you mean? How do you know? Asked Alice, feeling as if Trevor was reading her mind. Because you're leaving the house during the day, knowing that Mr. Page wouldn't be able to follow you, and also the fact that you don't want Mr. Page to follow you tells me that you're going to do something drastic, and don't want him to get involved. It isn't safe out there, Miss Grayson, and I do believe that the safest place for you right now is here, with us. Don't worry, Trevor, I'll be fine, said Alice, now smiling again at Trevor. She found it very sweet that he tried just as hard as Oliver to keep her safe. I'll be fine, okay? I'm only going to see Ophelia, and because it's the day, she won't be as strong. I can handle her. What? You're going to see Ophelia? Gasped Trevor as his voice shivered. Alice, please listen to me. Ophelia is extremely dangerous. You can't go in there alone. Alice watched as Trevor revealed to her the bruises left by Ophelia. She's not someone who should be taken lightly, said Trevor as he tried putting his injuries away. I'm not someone to be taken lightly either, said Alice as she caught Trevor's arm and put her hand to his wounds, healing them instantly. Alice then got up and left without saying another word. Trevor did not try to stop her because at that point, he wasn't sure he could. Chapter 37. Where does your allegiance lie? Alice stood on the sidewalk facing the building where the magazine was located. She couldn't help but reminisce about her first few months as an intern and how hard Christina had been on her, Sammy and Brian. The only goal at the time was to make a name for herself at the magazine, but things were different now. The doors in front of her didn't hold the same promise of opportunity anymore. They didn't hold the possibility of a better future for herself and her mother. Alice turned her head to the left and looked at the alley where she had been attacked by Jason, and felt guilty that someone so innocent was pulled into this chaotic war against Ophelia. Ophelia needed a pawn and Jason was just that. He didn't deserve his fate, and he wasn't the only one. Sammy, I'm sorry that I couldn't save you, said Alice as she turned her attention back towards the building. I'm sorry that I was such a lousy friend. You were always there for me, and I will never forget you. Mom, I'm sorry that someone so loving, so caring, someone so full of light, would be pulled into a world so dark. Ophelia isn't going to get away with any of this. I have the power to stop her now, so please watch over me. Alice stood deep in thought, going over the plan again and again in her head so as not to forget anything. In Alice's opinion, her plan was perfect. All she needed was to get Ophelia in her office. The doors of the elevator opened and Alice stepped out into the offices of the magazine. The place was neat, and there were no signs of any struggle having taken place. Ophelia must have had the place cleaned up after last night, Alice thought to herself. She remembered the sound of shattering glass when Ophelia had tossed Sammy's body to the side. But there was nothing, not a shard out of place. Alice walked through the bullpen when she saw her colleagues huddled together as usual, and felt a pain in her heart knowing Sammy wasn't standing with them. Alice tried to walk through the bullpen without getting noticed, when suddenly she heard her name being called out from the other side of the room. Alice looked over to see Brian standing by the water cooler, and thought to herself that she might want to tell him what was going on. She didn't know what was about to happen, but if she could have someone in the office that she knew she could trust, it would help her a lot. Hey, where have you been? Asked Brian as he stood up straight, bringing the water to his lips. Have you heard from Sammy or Jason? They didn't come to work today. Ophelia told us this morning that all three of you called in sick. Alice told Brian everything and waited for him to take it all in. At first, Brian argued with Alice, asking her if she was going crazy, asking her if she thought he was crazy, until Alice pulled Brian to the side, showing him how she created fire from her palm, then froze the flame, turning it into a piece of solid ice, and dropping it into his hand. Brian couldn't believe what he was seeing, but it was enough to convince him that Alice wasn't lying. Brian agreed to help Alice, and asked her what she needed from him. Alice instructed Brian to stand close by to their colleagues in case things got messy, and people needed to be evacuated. Brian nodded and walked across the room to take up his position, while Alice, now finally ready, made her way to Ophelia's office. Alice barged into Ophelia's office and found Ophelia in a meeting with two of her executives. The two executives looked startled, but Ophelia had a smile on her face as she looked up at Alice, giving Alice the impression that Ophelia knew she was coming. Ophelia kindly asked the two executives if they could speak to her assistant about rescheduling their meeting, telling them there was an important matter that needed tending to, and showed the two executives to the door, closing it behind them. Alice, what brings you here? Asked Ophelia, who seemed to be in a great mood. I didn't think you were coming in today after what happened last night. I told everyone you worked late, so I gave you, Sammy and Jason, the day off. Alice looked at Ophelia with a blank expression on her face because she couldn't believe how sadistic Ophelia truly was. She had turned a decent man into a monster, took the life of her best friend, and possibly also abducted her mother. How could Ophelia play the fool after causing so much chaos? I'm here to end this, said Alice as she readjusted herself, irritated by Ophelia's response. What do you mean to end this? Asked Ophelia as she dropped the facade. Have you come to turn yourself in? I told you I wasn't ready for you yet, but I could always keep you stored away till the time comes. Ophelia smiled at Alice, believing that her prey had come to her. Although she didn't have a problem getting to Alice at any point, Oliver was still going to put up a fight. Things couldn't have worked out better for Ophelia. Don't get me wrong, Ophelia. I'm not going with you. I said I came here to end this. No one is going anywhere. You aren't leaving this office. Ophelia looked at Alice and started laughing at the arrogance that Alice had started showing after only one night. Where is all this coming from? Asked Ophelia, sounding as if she couldn't be more amused. You're talking quite big for someone who doesn't have their guard dog with them. What exactly do you think you're going to do on your own? You f***ing insect. Ophelia dashed over to Alice and grabbed her by the throat, making it difficult for Alice to breathe. Alice kicked and struggled, but Ophelia's grip only tightened. Don't worry, I'm not going to kill you the same way I killed your friend. I have other plans for you. Ophelia watched as Alice struggled for air. When suddenly Ophelia's hand started heating up. Ophelia looked at her hand, watching the inside of her skin turn red as the blood started to boil inside her skin. She felt pain surging through her arm, making her lose her grip. What the FCK is this? Asked Ophelia as she backed up away from Alice, holding her hand in agony. It's natural magic, replied Alice as she let air into her lungs in order to relax her breathing. I found that I had a strong connection towards it, and it allows me to do a lot of things. Ophelia watched as the handprint she had made on Alice's neck healed instantly, then looked down and saw that the burn caused from touching Alice had started to spread and started burning off pieces of her arm. I came here to make you suffer, said Alice as she stood over Ophelia, who crawled backwards in order to create shelter for herself in the corner of her office. Ophelia didn't know what to do. Alice had suddenly gained immense power overnight, and it was not something she was anticipating. I'm going to make you tell me where my mother is, said Alice as she moved closer to Ophelia and bent down in front of her. I'm not going to tell you anything. Honestly, I'd rather let you kill me so I could watch you suffer from hell. So go ahead, kill me. I can make you feel like you're in hell if you want it so badly, said Alice as she rubbed her hand against Ophelia's face. Ophelia started feeling water coming up from inside her, quickly filling her lungs and making water gush from her mouth. Alice watched as Ophelia drowned in front of her, her eyes watering as she grabbed at her throat, struggling for air. Ophelia stuck out her hand trying to reach for Alice, but Alice got up and moved backwards so as not to wet herself. The battle felt won, and Alice stood victorious. She was in complete control and Ophelia was at her mercy. All of the fighting, all of the suffering could finally come to an end. Alice believed nothing could go wrong when suddenly, she felt a striking pain rushing from her head to the rest of her body. She felt herself losing consciousness as she fell to the floor. Who attacked her? Alice wanted to know. She fought to keep her eyes open till she fell to the ground and saw a glimpse of the person who had hit her from behind, the same person whom she had done her internship with, the person whom she entrusted the safety of her